Hey, welcome to the podcast for Bible Book by Book. This week we're in Ruth, and I'm joined by Lorna and Janet, and we just had a great discussion. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, Andrew Wilson this week on the Book of Ruth.
Very
good. And he obviously was live streamed into Tom as well.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, he's such a blessing, isn't he?
Oh, yes, he was very good.
Unpacking the story the way he does. It's
very
great.
Good.
Yeah, you think, you've read the Book of Ruth and you think, I really know this book well, and then he comes and preaches it.
Yeah.
And you think, my word, it's a whole different layer, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I brought my 3 little Russian dolls in today. So he talked about, it being a story, didn't he? That actually unpacks into a bigger story and to a bigger story. So we have the personal, corporate, and the global. And I thought it was so clever.
Yeah, it was
really
very good.
Wasn't it?
It was
you can
good.
read a story like this on one level and just think it's Ruth is a book, it's a beautiful, simple little love story. And then actually he helped us to really unpack it and discover more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I even said, just personally, like, the challenge of not only ever reading the Bible through the personal lens and looking for myself in the story all the time, and actually part of the beauty of the series is seeing things at the corporate and global level of what God's doing in and through Israel, and then ultimately what God is doing through his plan to bring through the Messiah. It's just incredible.
Yeah, and the way he drew the comparison with Boaz and Jesus, and for me, seeing, maybe for the first time, I don't know, but in some of these books, how they all point to Jesus.
Yes.
Everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus, and that's just so lovely.
Yeah. This whole sort of book by book series, isn't it beautiful? How you feel like you're weaving a bigger picture, don't you? Reading it all one after the other.
Yes, you do.
So enjoying that.
Yeah, me too. Very much so.
Yeah. So obviously Andrew started off by saying, what relevance has a story that was told 3,000 years ago got to do with us now, and then unpacked it so that you can see actually I'm caught up in this story. But it starts, doesn't it, with these 3 main characters, Boaz, Ruth and Naomi. And it starts in chapter 1 with quite a sad tale, really, of disappointment, grief, loss, sorrow and everything. And it just made me start reflecting on, how do we handle difficult times? How do we process that whole thing of living through hard circumstances sometimes and do that well? Any thoughts on that subject?
I think for me there's 2 strands. I think the first thing is in the human, we don't deny the pain and the grief and the anger and everything else, the human emotions that come out, because I think they're very real. And in my own experience, having experienced very real pain and disappointment, but somehow holding that intention with the fact that knowing that God has got us. His heart is for us. He knows the plans he's made for us, and it's holding those 2 things in tension, really, and never letting go of that, however hard it is sometimes, however hard we're finding life at the time.
Yeah, it's really helpful.
Yeah, and it helped, like, the fact that the Bible is a real account of real people and real situations helps us, doesn't it, when we encounter difficulty. I think the temptation, as sometimes is said, is, come and follow Jesus and everything will be all right.
Oh, yes.
And, life will be great. And it's like, you have an end to it. And obviously God does break through and God does intervene in situations, but often he's just present with us in pain and we find him there to be enough and or more than enough. We find him to be.
And his timing isn't our timing, and his plan as it unfolded, particularly in this situation in the Book of Ruth, can take years.
Yeah.
But we get quite impatient and want it all to get, our difficulties to get sorted immediately, and unfortunately they don't.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we see it through Naomi's eyes, where, actually I think Andrew put it in terms of it's like an exodus, wasn't it? And normally after an exodus, after a leaving somewhere and coming back to somewhere, you come back full, and she came back empty, to the extent that she says, change my name, I don't want to be called Naomi anymore, I want to be known as Myra, which is bitter. So obviously in that journey she was going through some really painful sort of soul-searching stuff, isn't it? And for me, I can think of a lady, a dear friend of mine, who has gone through similar loss, lost a husband, lost a son, and yet all the time when I talk to her, it's always I'm drawing on God, I'm looking to God. And I guess you get that choice, don't you, when you go through challenging times. Do I dig into God, or do I blame God and turn away from God? And and obviously the story with Naomi ends up in a really good place, but at this point, at the beginning of the story, she's really in a low place.
Yeah, she is.
And it's a theme that kind of comes through a lot of, particularly the Old Testament stories, but in a different way in the New Testament, of God being with us. And you look at Job, we're going to come to later on, it's like God literally allows Satan to take everything from him, and yet his conclusion is, but
yes,
Lord, you're still God. You're still like,
absolutely.
We can forget that, can't we? That actually we assume tough circumstances or difficult situations are the absence of God, whereas actually often, as you just said, people seem to get the most incredible revelations of God in the darkest place, in the most painful situations. And I think that's a challenge to us, isn't it? To sort of, particularly in a society, and I think COVID, that's why COVID was such a shock, wasn't it, to everyone, because we'd sort of bought into this idea of, everything's getting better and everything's going to be fine, and we're masters of our own destiny, and then bam, suddenly this thing happens that is way out of our control, and we all turn and go, wow, God, where are you? And I remember, Janet, even you bringing through prophetically just that thing of, we don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And actually that was what sustained a load of us and us as a church through COVID, wasn't it? It wasn't having all the answers, it wasn't having an immediate solution to the problems. It was just, God, we trust you and we're looking to you.
Yeah, that's good. And Lorna, I know, because we've talked, life experience hasn't always been easy, and you alluded to that earlier. How did you dig into God in those really painful times?
I remember one time I'd lost absolutely everything, and I was lying in bed at my mother's house, actually, and I just remember saying to God, okay, God, it's just me and you. I've got nothing, absolutely nothing. And for me, it was knowing, however hard it was, and it was jolly hard, I wouldn't deny that. It was knowing, though, that his heart was always for me, whatever happened to me, and hanging on to that in the darkest days, really, and never letting go of that, because if the minute I let go of that, I would have had nothing, absolutely nothing. So he was faithful, and with Naomi and Elimelech, they were disobedient. They did leave the promised land. They did marry their sons to pagan women, but God stayed faithful. And I felt that with me, that whatever I had done, he was still faithful, and he would bring me home, and he's blessed me 100-fold times over since. So just amazing. It is amazing, absolutely amazing.
I guess that leads on to another point in terms of waiting, doesn't it? Because, you might know the promises of God in your life, but there is a waiting time. So often that waiting time is difficult, isn't it? How do we wait well?
With difficulty, actually. we know, we trust God. We know his promises for us. We know he wants the best for us, but sometimes it seems like a very long time in the coming. And it's a bit like, as I've heard before, you're sitting in a waiting room, there's no way out, there's no sign to say you're next, and you just don't know how long you're going to have to wait, you don't know the way out, and you just have to sit and wait, and that's a really hard place to be. And I think perhaps that's when your faith is perhaps tested the most, actually. You have to sit and wait in the nothingness of what's happening.
That's really good. I must admit, I've been thinking about this since Sunday, and thinking about how so often we want things to happen straight away, don't we? And, we're quite an immediate culture, and, we get frustrated when the microwave doesn't ping, quicker than 30 seconds. And I started thinking about my own life, and when I find waiting difficult, and if I'm really honest, I find waiting difficult most of the time. And yet, here's a woman, Naomi, left without anything, holding on to just God probably by the sort of skin of her fingers, isn't she? And in the end, we have the beautiful hindsight of being a beautiful thing of having hindsight is being able to look back and see, how the story unfolded. But for her in that moment,
you're absolutely right, because I've thought in this story, we don't actually know when they got to Moab. We don't actually know what happened in those intervening years before she left again with Ruth. They just lived a normal life, I presume, and then Elimelech died, and then her sons died, and what happened then? And what was it that actually made her think, do you know what, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back home, because that's where God is, God's in the promised land.
Something drew her back.
Something drew her back. Yeah, it did. And Ruth saw in her enough to make her want to follow. And those are the most beautiful words in the Bible, aren't they? Your God will be my God. It's something I've thought often is, well, do people see enough in me, in us, to think, your God, I want to know your God. When I first became a Christian, that was something that I saw in Christians. I thought, I don't know what they've got, but I want some of that.
Wow.
And do people see... Ruth obviously saw that in Naomi, but do people see it in us?
It's a big challenge, isn't it?
It's a huge challenge.
And I know at Totten you've really focused, haven't you, on, sharing stories of sharing faith and things.
I mean, you can't beat the power of story. I think in terms of, we could share information till we're blue in the face, but actually there's nothing like hearing a good story. And I think even Andrew was talking, wasn't he, like the points that are being made through these stories that he was referring to, and actually when the penny drops, you're like, oh, that's really powerful. I wouldn't have understood that if I'd have just been told that. Actually, it's as you journey through something. And we've been celebrating, it's been important for us to celebrate obedience rather than success. I think that's sort of, we can so often put the responsibility for seeing someone saved on us rather than having the responsibility to be a faithful witness to the good news about Jesus. And again, I heard it said recently, we're called to be witnesses. What does a witness do? Well, they stand up and share their testimony and say, here's the God that I know. Here's the God who saved me. And actually then it's over to God to work out salvation in that person's life. And I think we can put too much pressure on ourselves, but equally that challenge of I'm also representing Jesus to these people without potentially there's scenarios and situations. I think of one side of my family, like I'm probably the only Christian that some of them know. With me and Ali, the only Christians they know. Okay, what does my life do? How do I provoke them?
What do they see?
Just as we hang out over Christmas and things like that, and family occasions. Like, and sometimes I'm a little bit bereft of was I just like them? Was I it's a real challenge.
Then you got the beautiful picture of Ruth, haven't you, coming from Moab, that lovely sort of sense of, but why are you being kind to me, Boaz? I am a foreigner, and so despised, so looked down upon. And yet Boaz welcomes her in, a beautiful picture of how Jesus welcomes us in, right into his presence. And I think that for me is like, I think that was just a fresh revelation when Andrew was talking about that verse in chapter 2, and it sort of says, who am I that you should welcome me in? And that's how God treats us.
Because she would have been one of the despised of her society, wouldn't she? She was a widow, she was childless, she was a pagan woman from Moab. So she wasn't top of the agenda, really. But he favoured her, he redeemed her. And like you say, Jesus does that to us. Doesn't matter who we are, doesn't matter what we've done. He's there and always wanting to sort of take us in.
I think that is extended, isn't it? Like even in, we talk a lot about the importance of our welcome on a Sunday, which I know is an area that you head up, Janet, but just that sort of sense of what people will often say is, I felt so welcome. Actually, that's a reflection of the welcome of God, isn't it? When people come in, there are no longer any untouchable people. There's no longer any people who are, in Jesus' eyes, there is no sort of scale of, you're just the down and outers and you're the people that society's reject. Actually, it's the people who are rejected by others who end up being drawn to him, and it's such an important part of our. And we've got to extend that not just from a Sunday, but into our homes and into the way we live our lives.
I was going to say that's a challenge to us, isn't it? That people perhaps who we would normally perhaps not want to mix with, or that we find difficult, or we shy away from, welcome them as Jesus would welcome them, and be kind. To be kind, really.
It's interesting as well, reflecting on Ruth, what Boaz noticed about her was that, was her serving of her mother-in-law, wasn't it? And, that passage you referred to, where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. Do not ask me to turn aside, I will follow you, And I think it just, again, opens up the whole question of serving, what does that mean to my life? How do I serve people well?
The people around us.
So that, I guess we're not judging them by what they look like, by what they do, by who they are. We're not just mixing with people that are like us.
No.
But actually we're here to serve, the whole community. And particularly the people of God as well in the church and things.
Sacrificially as well sometimes, isn't it? Not just the easy serving, but the serving that costs us as well. I think that's quite important.
That's good. Well, let's move on to that beautiful final picture of Boaz, because obviously a picture of Jesus, and he invites Ruth to come and eat at his table. And there's that invitation, isn't it? Come and eat at my table. And we ended up on Sunday breaking bread together, which was a lovely picture of that as well. Jesus invites us to his table, us as foreigners, as outcasts, as Gentiles, as sinners. He invites us in. And yet so often we come in with a sort of like baggage that we're carrying, or slightly reluctantly. What can we do to remind ourselves that we are God's people? We are dearly loved of God. There is no exclusion. We are included in.
I think my very favourite passage in the Bible is where in the Old Testament, where he says, you are the apple of my eye. And I think we need to hold on to that and understand that because Jesus died for us, because we are redeemed through him, not through anything we could ever do, that we are so precious to God, just so very precious, and He loves us beyond anything, absolutely beyond anything.
Yeah.
And at times when we sort of feel a bit down, or think, oh, I'm not good enough, or I can't do that, or I've done wrong things, just to always remember that He never lets us go. We're always the apple of His eye. That never changes.
Yes.
Never changes.
Yeah.
And we need community as well, don't we? In that, I think so often we try and go it alone and say, oh, I'll put a habit in to, remind myself that I'm loved every day. And actually, sometimes we need others just speaking.
Yes.
We're talking about connect groups, but just like getting alongside others and again, seeing that people outside of church need that as well. Like just that.
They do.
When we speak the hope of Jesus, we're not just saying, run away from all the bad stuff. Actually, there's a God who loves you. There's a God who, exactly as you just said, you're the apple of His eye. Like there's this sort of fierce love, but actually we need one another. Because we can often forget that, can't we? We get isolated, and the enemy likes to lie to us. That's his chief weapon, isn't it? He tells us lies, and often he will tell us the lies of as we wander into church on Sunday. Oh, I saw what you did on Friday. I saw how you talked to your kids, or said, what you did to that neighbour, or and just that. He'll use those things as sort of things to throw at us to make us doubt the fact that we are loved and the fact that we are chosen by God and invited to His table. I think it's a beautiful picture, isn't it?
And I think in our society today, a lot of people do feel very lonely and unloved.
Yeah.
They don't know how much God loves them, and that's our responsibility really to show them.
Yeah.
And so you end up with Naomi, this woman who says, "Call me bitter," and eventually you end up with her holding a little grandchild on her knee, and in the lineage of David and then of Jesus himself. It's just beautiful, isn't it? It's a story of such hope. A story of a love story on one level, a story of the Gentiles being brought in, foreigners being brought in, a story of the gospel, the good news that includes us in as well.
So
absolutely, it is absolutely lovely.
Hope that conversation really served you well. If you want to drop a comment below, then do so. Make sure you are genuinely subscribed. I know it's a bit cheesy, but make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you get these podcasts popping up on your YouTube, and have a blessed rest of the week.